All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. If we can advance to the next slide, that would be fantastic, Lisa. I just wanted to welcome everybody to this meeting. I am Dr. Julia Trochet. I am president of ARCE Missouri, and we just wanted to remind everybody, if you are not yet a member of ARCE or ARCE Missouri, please do consider joining. We do have a number of free and public workshops and lectures that we provide, but there are a few really cool things that we do that are only for members of ARCE Missouri. Usually in the fall, we have a great hands-on workshop where we'll send you a box if you're a member of with tools and materials, and then we'll recreate something like a scribal palette or a stone palette or perfume, and it's really, really fun and a great hands-on opportunity. So please do consider joining ARCE Missouri. When you sign up, just go ahead and choose the Kansas City, Missouri affiliation, but that is for the larger Ozarks region. And you get all these other benefits as well. And one of our next talks, before we sort of jump into this workshop, I wanted to give you a little bit of advertising, a sneak peek of what's coming next. We will have Professor Sarah Simmons with us, who is going to sort of get us really excited about the total solar eclipse that's coming up in April, right? And us in Missouri, we're going to be perfectly right in line to really get a good view of it. And so she's going to talk to us about stars sailing like the sun, depictions of star movements in ancient Egypt. And so that's going to be a really fun talk, again, to get us all sort of thinking about astronomy and ancient astronomy and all that good stuff. There's a QR code here, but you can also sign up by going to bit.ly/ARCE-MO Astronomy 319, because it's going to be on March 19th. And with that, I'm going to hand it right on over to the two heroes of this presentation, the two people who did the heavy lifting and who really are bringing us so much expertise and knowledge, and I cannot thank them enough, Dr. Lisa Haney and Dr. Ann Austin. I'm going to hand it over to you two. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. And a reminder to fill out that survey before, if you haven't yet, because that's going to help later in the talk, people sort of get a sense of who you all are. So Lisa and Ann, take it away.
Okay, sorry, there we go. Okay, so I am going to start by sharing a little bit with you all about what we hope to cover today. So we knew that this would be a really diverse group of people with different experiences, either getting grants, writing for grants, planning for grants, or maybe even just starting to think about how to use grants to fund their research. So we're going to start out by talking about where to find grant resources for Egyptology. Then we will focus in on how to tell a compelling story. So how to prepare yourself to write a fundable narrative that's focused on achievable objectives. And then we will pause for a little Q&A. And for anyone who is interested in participating in the interactive portion of this workshop, we will have an activity kind of focused on defining goals versus objectives and really focusing on how to turn goals into fundable objectives. And then there'll be kind of a final discussion at the very end.
So these are the results from the survey you just took, because we wanted to get a sense of who's in the room. I know we have people from all over the world here, and we have people with really varied backgrounds with grant writing. So you can see that about 2/3 of the folks who are here today have some experience writing grants that have done at least 1 to 5, but we also have about 1/4 of us or none. So Lisa and I have both written and gotten grants in Egyptology, but we are by no means the greatest experts in this. We're bringing our expertise as people who've failed and succeeded in this process. And because we have more people in the room, especially those of you who are not from America and have experience with writing grants in other parts of the world, we would love to get your input in today's conversations around grant writing. Also, it's really great to see how many of you are currently or not currently writing a grant proposal. We've got about 1/4 of you writing a grant proposal, and about 2/3 are not yet, but are about to start one. So this is the perfect time to be in this. If you're one of the no's and you're not writing a grant proposal yet, don't worry, that there's so much you can get out of this. And even with our activity at the end, where we're focusing on fundable objectives, I recommend that you participate there, because it gives you a chance to even start thinking about what would a grant proposal that you want to write look like. We also asked you what you'd like to get out of this workshop, and about 70% of you want resources on which grants you can apply to in Egyptology. We're going to provide some resources. We're coming from an American perspective, so if there's resources in your part of the world that you want to share, please feel free to share those in the chat. We also see that most of you are looking for tools to write more successful grant proposals in the future, and that's what we're really going to hone in on today. The slides that we have and the information we're presenting come from workshops that we've participated in. So we're bringing in expertise outside of ourselves to help you understand that grant writing process. About a quarter of you want help in an existing grant proposal. We're hoping our activity at the end will be really helpful and useful for you today. Obviously, we aren't going to be able to get into one-on-one help, but we are hoping that this might also foster some community for us to all work together and collaborating and writing more fundable grants in Egyptology. And then again, about almost 80%, so 4 out of 5 of you, are looking for knowledge about the grant proposal process. So especially those who are just starting, or you've only written internal grants and you haven't written external grants, this will be a great opportunity for you to get a sense of what that grant writing process looks like.
So some of our goals that we had when we were setting up this workshop, we hoped that everyone here would be able to learn more about potential funders and how to present their research, and how to be able to sort of understand and describe your project in a way that will increase your chances of being successful and ultimately being funded. Like Anne said, we're not professional grant writers, but we are people who have experience writing grants. And so we kind of just wanted to get everyone in a room together, get everyone chatting, and kind of see how we can all help each other move forward successfully, because everyone is awesome and totally deserves tons of money to complete their projects. So because we're all going to be working together, talking together, sharing ideas, we wanted to establish some workshop norms at the beginning of this process. And we'll kind of revisit these briefly before we get into our kind of interpersonal workshop. Everyone has something to offer and something to learn. Like Anne already said, a lot of you have experience writing grants, getting funding for your projects as well. And so we hope that everyone can remain open-minded and excited to both share what they have to offer and hear what other people have to say. Take space, make space. If you notice you haven't talked, feel free to share what you're thinking about or share your past experiences, but also make sure that we're saving space for everyone to be able to share as well. And then the last one is just speak from your own experience. We all have a ton of experience in the field and different types of lived experiences. So we really hope that this can be an extremely kind of collaborative and fruitful experience for everyone involved. So, now it's answered.
So where do you start? So what are some of the places we can look for grants that tend to fund the research we're doing in Egyptology? In the US, a lot of these are going to say are focused on US grants, because this is our experience. We have some major governmental institutes that tend to offer larger grants. So this would be like the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Science Foundation, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and the National Endowment for the Arts. These are the places where you're looking at more like 6-figure or 5-figure grants that can potentially be multi-year. These are also the most competitive grants, and they tend to have the most specific guidelines for how you should apply and what they're looking for. So if you're interested in any of these types of grants, what I recommend is looking at some of the resources that are available for those specific agencies, because there are a lot that can help you on making sure your grant proposal meets the requirements for that. If we look more specifically at ones that are geared toward area-specific, Egyptology-specific focus, of course, for us, there's the American Research Center in Egypt. We also have the American Society for Overseas Research, or ASOR, the Archaeological Institute of America, and the Society for American Archaeology. So these are all U.S. organizations that are focused on particularly grants for Egyptology and archaeology. If you're a graduate student, there's an International Dissertation Research Fund. So that's a great opportunity for you to get a grant that really can get your research accomplished. And for those of us who are working on smaller projects in Egyptology, there's also the Russ Family Foundation, which is a private granting organization. They do small grants, but this can be really useful. A lot of us often, many of these grants are one-year grants from the area specific section. So you might have to apply to all of these to get grants over the span of 5 to 10 years, which can be the length of many of our projects. I also wanted to draw some attention to some very specific ones. The Black Trowel Collective microgrants are great opportunities for students and scholars in archaeology in the US that can get these really much smaller level grants. These can even sometimes be used for instance, conference work. And the Sportula has grants for students and scholars in classics and related fields. We also have links to BU and Cornell's websites because they aggregate many of these places where you can find grants. And so these will make sure that these slides are available. Any of you who are interested to learn more about these types of granting agencies, feel free to click through to those links. The other thing you should keep in mind are the differences between internal and external grants. So I used that phrase earlier. If you're not familiar with it, many institutions have their own grants designed to help fund their students and faculty, particularly at the seed stage, at the beginning of a project. So what I'd recommend is if you're at a university, look to see what your department, usually there's a very specific office focused on grants, what they can tell you about internal resources. These are also the grants that are easiest to get as a graduate student, and they're the ones that kind of help you learn about the grant writing process. These tend to be less competitive, and they tend to have less paperwork involved, so the amount of effort is usually far less than some of these other organizations. See if there's other people at your institution who might be aware of specific opportunities, and find out if you are qualified to submit. So for students, sometimes you are not qualified to submit on your own. You have to have a faculty member submit on your behalf. Many institutions have internal incentives and programs designed to fund research projects at both the student and professional level. So you also might see that there are very specific grants for students and postdocs that aren't available to faculty. Now, today we want to talk about what makes an excellent proposal, what makes a fundable proposal, and it's actually pretty simple in its core. So your fundable proposals have intellectual merit and impact, and this is going to come out of the summary you have for your grant, out of a project description that you write. And speaking broadly, most grants require some kind of abstract at the beginning and some kind of broader project description. So these are the places where you mention what that intellectual merit and impact is. The next component of a really excellent proposal is the credentials of the PI and the team. So the person who is in charge of the project and the people who are participating in any of the stages. In many grants, the way that you demonstrate that is through presenting CVs or bios of some kind, describing the resources available to your project and the different kind of collaborators you plan to work with. And then the last component of an excellent proposal is a basic budget, timeline, and supporting documents to show that these things are achievable. So each of these components is putting together the idea that you have the best idea with the best investigator, and you're conducting the research in the best way possible. If you can basically hold those three components together, then a lot of times you're presenting that you have a grant that is fundable and achievable. And that's what we're going to aim to describe to you today by presenting basically some of those key components to a grant. And then we'll do a little bit of fine tuning around the objectives that you write to show that you're able to achieve what your aims are in the proposal. The typical parts of a grant proposal begin with a summary or abstract, and then go on to this narrative where you describe the problem or the significance of your project, your objectives, your work plan and your evaluation strategy, how you plan to evaluate that you've achieved what you aimed for. A lot of grants then also require that you identify your resources, the CVs and bios, your budget, and supporting documents. That might be letters of commitment from organizations you plan to work with. You could see, for example, if you're planning to go to a museum, you might want a letter of commitment that the museum will allow you to do your research. There's policies that you might need to present, your bibliography, certifications, etc. There's enough work that could be done. We could have a workshop just on budgets and grants, or a workshop just on your CVs, right? So these are different professionalization opportunities that we'd love to do in the future. Today, we're really going to focus in on the narrative, because I think that's the part that's most mystifying about grant writing. And this just gives you a preliminary outline of what that narrative looks like. So the summary is your brief outline of what you're requesting, what you're proposing to do. It includes the total amount of money that you're requesting. It's your abstract. It's your very simple sentence by sentence description of the rest of the proposal. You'll see today, we don't even mention the summary until the end, because that's actually the last thing you write, since you're summarizing everything else you've already written. The second part is your problem or significance. So you're answering the questions, why does this work matter? What is innovative or transformative about this project? Your third area are your objectives. So what do you plan to accomplish? And what do you do if things go wrong? This is particularly important to have basically backup strategies. You could imagine if you don't get the permissions to do the full research you want to do in the place you want to do it, in the timeline you plan to do it, you need to demonstrate that you've planned for those issues in your objectives. And then there's your work plan. How will you actually accomplish these objectives? What resources do you have in place? What will you need? So resources meaning what kind of supplies, budgets, etc. You should include an overview of your team and your timeline to make sure that you've got a clear idea of who's doing what and when. And then there's that evaluation, that final part of the narrative. So what are your intended results, and how will you assess your success in achieving them? And this is where you need to really demonstrate that not only are you going to conduct this research, but also that you have a clear plan in mind for how those results are going to be completed and disseminated. So as I mentioned, we're not actually going to start with our abstract with point 1, because that's something we're not even going to worry about until we finish the rest of our grant writing. So I want to talk to you first about that problem statement, or your significance or impact statement. This is referred to differently across many grants. So you might see this referred to as your need, or as significance, as your background and rationale, as problem analysis or discussion or justification. In some grants, it's situational analysis. That's less likely in our fields, but this gives you an idea across many different granting organizations, how they frame this portion of the grant. Regardless of which one they use, what the problem statement does is you're briefly outlining, basically, first of all, what are you even proposing to do? So you're giving that kind of introduction to what the grant is about. And what you're doing in that introduction, instead of just saying exactly what you plan to do, what you're doing is saying, what is your broader impact? Why are you doing this research? So you actually start out in your problem statement with that why. And the way that you frame that why is through a gap that needs to be filled. So it's important to show that doing this research is helping the field or helping Egyptology in some way. And the way to accomplish that is by using data to show the extent of the gap or the problem, reviewing and relating it to relevant projects that have already happened or are ongoing, evaluating previous methodologies in case you're trying to improve methods in a specific way, and clearly defining how your project will be different from what happened before. So this is an area where you have some literature review and you have some focus on what has happened in the field and where are we missing information that your project can actually help to contribute to. And then you want to clearly explain what you plan to accomplish and how. So in the problem statement, you want to have a brief description of how your project will differ from and expand on previous work. And you want to describe any theoretical or conceptual framework that underlies the proposed research. So this is also where you give some of that background on the methodology you plan to use in order to fill in that gap. To give you just a few tips on what a problem statement can do, try to find ways to demonstrate that what you're doing is distinct from what's happened before. So grant writing organizations aren't going to necessarily fund something just because you're continuing what's happened. They want to see that you're innovative in some way. So perhaps one way of doing that is offering a new approach. You're finding a different way of asking and answering a question that's been answered before, but maybe not using the same method. Maybe you're challenging existing research paradigms. So maybe your project seeks to shift or challenge what current research practices say, what people have been arguing so far. Maybe you're providing novel methods. So are your concepts, approaches, methodologies, instrumentation, are they novel to the field? Do they offer something new? And a last way is, are you refining or improving? Are you proposing to refine or improve or apply new concepts or approaches or methods? So you don't have to do more than one of these, but it's helpful if you can frame your problem and frame the way you're solving it through one of these approaches. So you're either doing new thinking, you're challenging research paradigms, you're offering novel methods, or you're refining and improving. Now, this is all kind of hard to, I think, put into place without examples. So Lisa and I provided examples of some of our grants. These are by no means perfect, but they just give you a sense of how we've tried to tackle the issues we have for you today. So this was a grant that I did for the University of Missouri that did get funded. And this is part of my problem statement. And I want to just break down how I see each sentence contributing to what I just described. So this grant was about doing more research on tattooing in ancient Egypt, which is one of my areas of study. And here's how I framed it as part of the problem statement. This research broadens our understanding of tattooing in ancient Egypt and also enhances the potential for the future identification of tattoos during excavation and in museums. So that's speaking to the broader impact. Why am I doing this research? Why should the grant funders care? I then go on to explain the gap by saying evidence for Egyptian tattooing outside of Deir el-Medina is extremely limited. Scholars have only identified 6 individuals with tattoos, and among these, only 5 of their tattoos are figural and therefore can be associated with cultural meaning. So here, I'm looking at where do we see a gap and what's existing of the research? How can I fill in that gap? At Deir el-Medina, we've already identified figural tattoos on 7 different mummified fragments, making it possible to offer new sites and interpretations of the practice of tattooing. So here, I like to show that I've already been doing this research. I have some preliminary results. This is great if you do have preliminary results because you're demonstrating to the grant funders, look, I already am showing you this is a slam dunk case. I know we can get some of the results we are expecting because we already have preliminary results that are showing that this work is accomplishable. And then I write, additionally, this varied evidence gives us the unique ability to test and improve methods used to detect tattoos, which will aid in the future identification of tattoos among human remains elsewhere. So this is filling a gap in the research. If you think about what I was just showing in terms of those tips, here I'm offering novel methods to approach this topic in other parts of the world.
Okay, so the third area that you'll come to in your sort of narrative will be your objectives. So what exactly do you plan to accomplish with your project? You may see this referred to as results, outcomes, goals, or impacts, but these are all really kind of referring to the same thing. This area is particularly important because it should really be the focus point of your entire proposal. So everything else that you're going to talk about should work to support the objectives that you're proposing. So one of the things that we really want to focus on today, and that will be the major focus of our interactive activity later, is the difference between goals and objectives. What you want for your proposal are clear objectives. So a goal, which it still is important to define the goals for your research and the goals for your project generally, because those can lead you to develop your outcomes, but goals are usually general. They're unlikely to be achieved by the end of a grant project. Something like, I see that there is a note for myself to update this example, which I did not, but I think we can still, get the vibe. So a goal would be to improve community health, right? An objective, on the other hand, is something that's measurable. It's something that you must be able to achieve by the end of the grant term, whether that's 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, and something that leads towards a specific goal. And we will look at relevant examples of objectives here in a minute. But so you can see how they changed and created these 3 objectives that all fit under the goal of improving community health, right? Increasing immunizations by 10% in 2 years is a measurable, time-bound, specific objective. And the same for these other 2 examples as well. And one way to assess your objectives is to determine whether or not they have merit. So when you're evaluating your objectives, they should be measurable, which means they have a specific focus. They should be end-oriented, meaning they are capable of being achieved and completed during the grant period, because that period of time is the only period of time that funders are interested in. They should be realistic. Again, this is something that you can realistically achieve. Anne's example, where she included those primary results, that kind of primary data that she had, that's something that helps you show that your project is realistic. You can realistically do what you're saying in the time period or for the amount of money that you're applying for. It identifies a need, and again, it's timed. And so this is a good set of criteria that you can use to evaluate your objectives as you're creating your project. Some tips that you can focus in on when you're creating your objectives. So you don't want to have too many different objectives, right? And this gets back to that idea that they should be realistic and achievable within the time frame. So you should stick to between 2 and 4 objectives, or maybe even 1, depending on the kind of size of the grant that you're applying to, the size of the project that you're proposing. I think sometimes it's easy to kind of get carried away in your excitement over a project or in what you hope to achieve for a project long term versus the specific window of time that you're applying for in the grant. You should use verbs like identify, characterize, quantify, increase, or decrease. Words that kind of are related to these specific outcomes, as opposed to things like understand, study, examine, attempt, or explore. You want to really reinforce through the language that you're choosing the significance of your objectives and their achievability. And then also it's a good idea to sort of rank them in their order of achievability, or perhaps depending on the project, the order of their kind of importance to the project. And again, we'll kind of get into this with some examples here in just a second, but objectives really state what your project will achieve, not how you will achieve it. So that's another part of your narrative statement, which will happen after. So here, you just want to be upfront, really clear, hit people with what you're wanting to put out there, and then you can kind of get into the details as you move along through the proposal. So these are some different kinds of general examples, and then we'll look at a specific example from a grant that I recently submitted. So to further knowledge of college faculty regarding new concepts and methods for mathematics education. So this is something that is measurable in that it can be surveyed in the end We'll talk about evaluation as one of the final parts of your narrative statement. So when you're creating these objectives, you want to make sure that there's something that can be evaluated, so you have a way of determining your success. Enabling faculty to incorporate these new approaches, stimulating student interest in mathematics by applying the new techniques that are being created, and to create a model for testing whether or not these outcomes were achieved. So this is an example from a project that we recently submitted for a National Endowment for the Humanities grant. This is kind of a museum-focused example, but so one of our goals for this grant was to investigate one of the objects in the museum that will be part of a new gallery renovation and is in need of some care. So our goal was to investigate the boat and better understand its needs moving forward so that we could create opportunities for visitor connections. And this is what the objective tied to that goal looked like in our proposal. And I won't read out loud the entire thing, but what I wanted to highlight here is that one thing you can use to your advantage in especially these longer proposals that you have to submit for these bigger granting agencies like the NEH, like IMLS, is formatting. So this project had 3 different specific objectives. And so what we did when we described them was we bolded the main portion of the objective at the beginning of the paragraph. So the main objective here was to complete a conservation assessment for the Dashore boat. We then gave kind of a little summary statement like the one Anne showed you in her previous example, that talks about why this is important, what's the information that we're missing, and how we're going to achieve this. And then we had a small bullet point underneath that listed the specific output associated with this objective. So the specific outputs for this objective are a detailed conservation assessment, including plans for the disassembly and reassembly of the boat, treatment recommendations, and recommended parameters for future display. Because, in the case, most of the time, the people who are reviewing these grants are just like people like us. There are other people in the field. There are other kind of related experts. And so anything you can do to visually cue people to the important information that you want to make sure they read is a benefit to you. Because just like probably any paper that you've ever read, you're almost never sitting there reading every single word straight through. I know we all like to imagine when we work for like 6 months preparing like a 20-page long grant proposal that every single word is being savored. But that's probably not the case in reality. So especially with these objectives, like I said, anything you can do to sort of really define visually and make clear what the important information is can help you be successful. So the next kind of piece of this puzzle is your work plan. A work plan is a detailed description of all of the activities you need to do in order to achieve your objectives. So this can be called activities, procedures, approaches, strategies, but all of these are really asking for the same information. So some things that you want to keep in mind when you're pulling together your work plan is, like I said, to be focused on your objectives and outcomes. You want to start with the largest and most detailed sections first. You want to be sure that this includes a justification of the methodology that you're using. Another key is that you acknowledge and anticipate any potential issues or obstacles. I know with larger granting agencies like the NEH and IMLS, this is something that they explicitly ask you for. So like Anne said, what if your permit doesn't come in? What if you were supposed to contract a conservator and they didn't start in the time you thought they did, or their visa didn't come through? You should anticipate that problems might occur and kind of have a little backup plan for that. And then you want to cite any relevant preliminary data or publications. Another important thing, and I'll show you an example of this in a couple slides, is that you want to have a visual component of this as well. You want people to read this, to understand clearly exactly how you're going to accomplish all the things you're laying out, and you want them to be able to see that as well visually. So in your work plan, the things that you are going to want to include are an overall strategy. And again, the clearer and the more simplified you can have that strategy, the better, the easier it will be for your reviewers to understand. You want to know who your target audience is. So who will this project be engaging and how? This is something that might be more relevant for museum projects or projects where you have kind of a public broader impacts. You want, again, a clear and simple descriptions of the activities. What in detail are the tasks that you will need to undertake? Who will be doing this? How will they be doing it? And what will the results be? How will you evaluate those results? And then what is your timeline for achieving each one of these tasks and then your ultimate objectives? So broader impacts are something that you might see mentioned in a lot of grants and something that may be sort of that last part of your work plan, right? What do you hope to achieve and how are you going to share those results? And some grants, especially some of these larger kind of national grants or even like even internal grants sometimes, they usually want you to either disseminate information or to create a shared resource. And so it's really important, as Anne said, when you're preparing to explore what grant opportunities best fit your project, that you also understand what the broader impacts are that are expected of you and how that funder wants you to either disseminate or share the results of your project. So, like I said, the timeline is an important part of your work plan, and creating a visual timeline is really important in order to help reviewers visualize the project. And it also shows that right, that your objectives are realistic and achievable because you've broken everything down. You understand exactly what it's going to take in order to accomplish this project on the sort of timeline that's proposed. So this is part of a work plan that we submitted for, trying to see which grant this was, for an NEH grant that was funded to do some prototyping for digital interactives for our new Egypt Hall at the museum. And so this is how we laid out our work plan. We had a little summary here describing the project team that would be involved. And then we had this sort of table that broke down each individual task based on the month. This is a list, this listed out each of the members of the project team who were involved by their initials. So that linked then to the later bios and CVs for those individuals, and then the task. And we started all of these tasks that are marked pre-award tasks that were essential to our completing the grant as proposed. And so we included those as well. So you can see we start with an architectural assessment, hiring different individuals that were essential to the project and whom we had requested money to hire those individuals in our grant. And then for this grant, we had broken it down into some different phases. And so each one of the steps involved in those phases is outlined here in this sort of table.
This is another example just to give you some diversity on how these work plans can look. This is also an NEH grant, so I decided to do this one side by side with Lisa's just to show you that even within the same grant, you can have more than one way of presenting this information. So this was a 3-year project that I worked on, and I have the full fundable narrative. I have a link that I will put in the chat so you can see it too, because this is online. So if you're interested in just seeing an example of one of these larger scale grants, this narrative is available. And when we broke down our work plan, we did it in multiple phases. And within each phase, we identified which period that would be. And just like you saw with Lisa, we identified who was participating, but we did this by having our tasks with our initials in parentheses after each task that's presented. So this is one way to present if you've got, basically a lot going on and it's hard to fit a table on a single page. We ended up using more of a narrative style to do our work plan and to show what our timeline was looking like. I am also happy if anyone wants to see an example of how I've done this for an excavation timeline. There you're working sometimes in a much tighter period. But what I want to emphasize is that your work plan does not start and end with just the research period. It should start with some of those earlier preparation examples. So like what Lisa was just showing with the period, her pre-period, where they were hiring folks to actually do the work. And then it should end with your outputs. So when I do my excavation timeline, I actually have a lot of content that happens before I get in the field and after the field. That's part of my timeline. In addition to having a timeline in your work plan, you need a budget. As I mentioned before, budgets have their own parameters and would be an entire talk on their own. But in general, from the experiences that we've had, they've generally been subdivided by the granting organization often into categories. So how much money are you spending on salaries, on travel and subsistence, on supplies and materials, publication costs, and then your direct versus indirect costs. If you're unfamiliar with this, our direct versus indirect costs include basically what are the expenses of just having this grant in your organization. Indirect costs are those that come from the granting agency itself or from a university. And I'd recommend before you even start applying for a grant, check to see if indirect costs are covered and if they're already part of the grant. So for example, I'll say if you get an Antiquities Endowment Fund grant at ARCE, I believe indirect costs for ARCE to offer these grants are something that you need to put into the calculations, and that's around 20%. Each university has their own set rate for indirect costs. So when you're applying to larger grants, you need to know what your university's overhead cost is. And the idea is that universities need money for these grants to run. So they have a granting office and they have to pay for the salaries of those people. They have to pay for their computers, electricity, etc. And so the university justifies this by saying, well, you give us like 20% or more of your grant. And these, for me, when I started writing grants, this was the biggest shock of how much money I had to write into a budget that I would never see. The other thing I want to mention about this is some grants do not allow indirect costs. So particularly smaller single year grants for archaeology, those will not cover indirect costs, and you need to have, in some cases, those to be approved to run through your university because they are not going to get any money from them. Because they're smaller, I've never seen people have issues with that, but it's something that can be a surprise if you haven't encountered that before. And this is just an example of what some of those budgets can look like and how they can be organized. In the Antiquities Endowment Fund, for example, they have budget forms, so you should follow those very carefully when they are provided. And you have to provide evidence for your estimates in grants. So when you put the dollar amount that you expect, find ways to justify that dollar amount. One example is, how do you estimate cost of living? So the per diem, how much it'll cost per day for people. If you're in the United States, there's a website through the government that actually posts what per diem rates are for government organizations when they are funding. For instance, like if you're going to a conference and you're looking at how much should I expect to pay per day to eat in Chicago, they'll give you those guidelines. So use those types of guidelines to justify how much you're planning. And generally, you want to provide cushion in your grants because, as we've seen, for instance, in Egypt in the last year, cost of living has gone up a lot. So remember that the amount that it costs today might not be the amount that it costs when you're actually spending that money, and that's something that you should plan for. And then what are the reviewers actually looking for when they read your work plan? So they're looking for, why are you doing these things? What critical information will they provide? What result do you expect? How will you confirm it? What if you get a different outcome than what you were expecting? What is your plan if what you've proposed doesn't work? So what are your backup plans? Have you tried this work before? Do you have evidence that you actually know what you're doing, basically? And does the data relate to the proposed activities? They also want to know who's in charge, who does what, how will all the different aspects be coordinated and integrated? How will you know if the project is on track? What are your process objectives? How do you show that you are able to keep that process going? And what are the broader impacts? So I bring up all of these. When you go to these slides in the future, look, can you answer all of these questions using your project narrative? If not, then your reviewers aren't going to be able to demonstrate from what you've given them that this is fundable. So keep these questions in mind, come back to these slides as you've written a narrative, look to see if these are answered. And then we get to this final evaluation piece. So you want to discuss your plan to determine if your project achieved the intended results and is being implemented as planned. You could see this as program evaluation, program assessment, plan to measure, measure of success, or simply results. Your evaluation should include the types of data collected in your data collection plan, how and when the data will be collected, how data will be analyzed, and how will results be reported and to whom. This has gotten increasingly important as institutions have demanded data management plans, and as many institutions have demanded open access publication. So you should have very clear plans for how your data will be shared and where and to whom they will be available. And any publications, be aware of the limitations there are for open access and whether you need to put in the budget some of the costs associated with publishing open access. And then finally, we get back to point 1, your summary or your abstract. So again, you write this at the very end. This is a short, clear statement of what you want and why. It acts as a guide to all the other sections of your narrative. This could be the executive summary, the proposal overview, proposal synopsis, the abstract. Any of those are used to talk about this. This is actually the first thing that they read, but it's the last thing that you write. And it should be a half page to up to 2 pages max. It depends on the size of the grant. So if you're doing a smaller grant, it should be a shorter abstract. It basically should be almost for each section that we described, a 1-sentence summary. So you're providing the framework for your proposal. So why does this work matter? This should be very public facing. So this is often used by funder to publicize a project. So don't use jargon or terminology in this section. And it should be very clear, concise, and engaging. It can likely, some people, I mean, keep in mind the grant reviewers are humans and they are doing just so much work to review these. So they might be looking at dozens or even hundreds of proposals, and the only thing that they can start with is that summary. So make sure that that is really your cleanest writing, because that might be the only writing that they see to determine whether or not they're going to move forward with your proposal. Basically, as I mentioned, it should basically have a sentence for each part of the proposal we've discussed so far. So it maps out the rest of the proposal. So you have at least a sentence on the problem or need, a sentence on your objectives, a brief summary of your methods to demonstrate that you can achieve those objectives, and your expected outcome or impacts. Don't go into too much detail on any one of these because it's going to make it hard for them to follow the full map. All right, so that brings us to the end of our first section. We wanted to leave a couple minutes here for Q&A in case, as we got through that, you guys had some questions that you wanted to bring up. We also wanted to emphasize that after this short Q&A, we're going to do a little interactive where we're working on writing objectives. And if you are currently working a grant, or if you're just thinking about it and you know what you'd want to write about, that would be a really useful exercise, and we recommend you stay for that. So let's get started with questions. If you have questions, feel free to throw them into the Q&A section. They might get lost in the chat. And if any of our co-hosts have questions, feel free to say them out loud.
I just had one thing. Some people also at their institutions, especially if it's an academic one, there may be research centers that are specifically, they are run by faculty and specifically designed to be sort of research collaboratives where a lot of people are working on the same stuff. And so you might find collaborators in there also. But even if it's not like Egypt, you know, the Center for Egyptology or whatever, there may be like a humanities or a social sciences center on your campus, and you can go and you can find a collaborator who will bring, again, those broader impacts and stuff in. So, and when you were talking about, you know, going to offices at institutions for that sort of thing, I was just going to suggest going to a research center too, because those are really useful. We do have a question. Sorry,
Hannah said, thinking about budget cushions, how do you evidence this and how explicit are you about them in the budget? That is a great question. I've gotten more specific about this for Egypt because we've seen such variation in costs of living in Egypt in the last few years. So sometimes I explicitly include, so I'll say one thing. In the United States, the per diem rates for Egypt are absurd. They're like if you're going to live an American lifestyle in Luxor and stay at a 4-star hotel. So fortunately, some budget cushions can be built into, for me, into that, which helps me. For if I'm applying to a grant with an institution that's very familiar with Egypt, I'm less likely to get that funded if I'm saying, you know, it cost me $120 a day to live in Luxor. They know better. So in those cases, what I'd recommend is you can present actually some of that evidence to say inflation in Egypt the past year has gone up this percentage. So I anticipate by the time that I'm actually in Egypt using this funding, I'm adding that percentage to it and make it a calculation. So show that you're not just pulling these numbers out of nowhere, but you're presenting them with some evidence. And that can apply not only for things like how much it costs to eat, but for supplies. That's a huge shift that I think we've seen not only in Egypt, but if you're working in, you know, other parts of the world, that supply chain changes have made supply costs go up a lot.
For the museum, what we do often for if we're working with different like vendors or like we're contracting with a design firm or something is to get a quote. So if you have a particular group or organization you're going to be working with or a company that you plan on, like we had to order some special shelves, so we got a quote for the shelves. It shows that you have done your due diligence so that if, let's say when you go to order the shelves like a year later, by the time that you find out that you get this grant, and the shelves are more expensive, like, you know, you can at least show when you ask for that adjustment that you got a quote, you know, this is what happened. And you can go back for multiple quotes too. We had a project that didn't get funded that we had applied for, and we had gotten a quote that it would be like XYZ to do this work in the gallery. And then when we reapplied, the cost was like twice as high because I guess like wood prices went like insane last year. So, I mean, some stuff you can't really calculate for, but as long as you can show when you presented your material, hey, I had gotten all these quotes and done XYZ, you can, for certain funders, kind of reallocate things in your problem solving area, some of your backup plans if things are out of control.
Julia, we can't hear you for some reason. No. You can text it to me or type it in the
Put it in the Q&A, Julia. Feel free to ask questions in the Q&A. We'll spend a few more minutes here and then we'll move on to the last section of our presentation.
One question I have is, where did you find all of those memes? Because every single one of them was amazing. I'm glad I was on mute. I was on mute, but I was dying over here. I was laughing.
Really desperate to find some fun pictures, and I actually found a blog about grant writing memes. So there were a lot of other fun ones on there that were more science and engineering kind of related, but thank you.
So Julia asked, what are the roles of rejections, feedback in the cycle of grant writing? Should you reapply to the same one multiple times? Which is a great question. And this is, I think, from my experience, really dependent on which grants you are applying to. There are some grants where their intention is that they will reject you before they fund you. So I've seen cases where the funding rates are so low, let's say they're like below 10%, that it's very unusual for someone to be funded on their first try. And there's a review process where you have multiple reviewers, they give you feedback, and then you reincorporate and reapply. So if you, I think I want to emphasize that we very rarely see people's rejection CVs, but I think they're really helpful to see how many times something was rejected before it was accepted. It's an iterative process. So you should not be surprised if you get rejected. Some grants do not give you feedback. You are allowed to ask for that feedback. So if you don't get funded, you can write back and say, thank you for letting me know. If you have any comments or suggestions for the proposal for the future, I would love to get that feedback. And you can get that information sometimes depending on the funder. Lisa, do you have other thoughts about this question?
No, I would say definitely reapply for grants, especially larger ones. Like one of the bits I shared was for I think it was the project plan, was for a grant that was the second time we were applying for that same grant, because for the bigger places like NEH, NES, IMLS, those places, you will get your comments back. And if you work at a larger institution like a museum or a university, they probably have a program officer. Like we have a program officer for the NEH, Jill, who is super awesome. And they will work with you too. And a lot of those bigger grants have early deadlines where you can get feedback on a draft, which we always do every time. Like I know that NEH does that, where you can like submit a draft of your narrative or of your budget like a few weeks earlier, a month earlier, something like that, and they will give you feedback on it before you even submit it.
Yeah, and I'll say if you do work with at a university where you have a grant office, you get a lot of great feedback from them, but they will be sticklers on you giving them time to give you that feedback and you having time to get that back. So don't give them your grant proposal the day before it's due. And they will give you their timelines and when they need to get stuff. They understand that we don't always have the luxury of having more time. So I'd say it's never early enough to start writing a grant and to present that, even if it's not going to be due for a few more months. Ginger asked, are there grants that are more focused on the dissemination of Egyptology than on research? So I can say I know the Antiquities Endowment Fund has a publication subsidies grant, and that's funded through ARCE, the American Research Center in Egypt. I am not super familiar with a lot of other ones, but Lisa, maybe you know some more.
Depending on how you want to disseminate your knowledge, IMLS, I would say more so NEH and NEA have tons of different types of grants. Like, are you wanting to create a database? Is it a digital project? Are you creating something for a museum, for a historical society, for a library? Is it like a open access publication? So I think knowing what you want to do for your project is the most important thing, and then spending some time on these websites for these larger granting institutions. Like it sounds maybe like the NEH might be a good one for you, just depending on how you're planning to disseminate the information that you're wanting to share. There are tons of different options, and most of the grants are also multi-tiered, which means you could get an initial grant just for planning what you might want to do. Like, let's say you have a bunch of data and you're like, I want to plan for creating an interactive database where people can look at all of the pre-dynastic W ware and like follow the images through time, or kind of whatever it is. And then you could get like, you could get a planning grant, you could get a prototyping grant, and then you could get your actual implementation grant where you're making the thing. But there are all sorts, archives, all kinds of different subsets of projects in there.
And I have one last question that I want us to answer, and then I'm going to have a switch to our last portion of this. Julia asked, and I'm going to have Julia answer, does RC Missouri offer any grants? As our president, Julia, why don't you contribute?
Okay, the question is if you can hear me. Okay, so I can answer this. It wasn't may I, it was literally can I. Yeah, so RC Missouri does offer some grants, and I wanted to highlight that not just because of being the president of RC Missouri, but also because a lot of organizations like ours, regional, smaller organizations, do have small grants. And ours, I think we only go up to, I don't know, maybe a couple hundred. It's changed over the last few years, but if you can get a couple of those together, sometimes that's enough. And sometimes if you just need a couple hundred to sort of make do with traveling to a conference or something. But I did want to highlight, we are trying to focus because of tax laws and things. We have requested in the past for only US citizens to apply. And that is something you'll see in some granting institutions because of where the money is coming from. But all that's to say, we haven't had a huge number of applicants historically. And one of the things in particular that we haven't seen, this sort of reminded me from the outreach question, is our funds to help people go to the annual meeting, the RC annual meeting, but also for the K through 12 educators to order materials to teach ancient history in their classrooms. And so thinking about disseminating and grants for disseminating Egyptology, there may be organizations such as RC Missouri in the state where you live, where you could apply for small grants that could work towards disseminating information in different contexts. For us, you do have to be an RC Missouri member, and so that is one of the benefits of membership. And if you cannot afford an RC Missouri membership, you can write that into your request for the grant. So we will bring you in and help you become an RC Missouri member, so that way you can receive that grant money. But yeah, back to you guys.
Great, thank you, Julia. So we want to end with, we will have a little bit less time than we're planning, but we wanted to make sure that you actually got to work on your grants that you're thinking about writing or currently writing, and go back to what Lisa presented on goals versus objectives. And why does it really matter that we use these two words and that you can differentiate them? So the ability to explain your project and its intended outcomes is clear, easy to understand language, and it can help you increase your chances of success. So what are these differences? Our goals, as a reminder, are these general things. They're unlikely to be achieved by the end of the grant, and they speak to broader impacts, versus objectives are measurable, and they must actually be achieved by the end of the grant, and they lead toward goals. So I want you to think of these as having two different functions in your proposal. Your goals are things to show why should anyone care about this grant, and your objectives are showing how you are actually those steps to meet your goal. So they're showing that what you're doing is actually achievable. So in the grant that I presented earlier, I started off just saying, I want us to better understand the practice of tattooing in ancient Egypt. And that was kind of my overarching goal for the grant that I applied to. But when you read that, you can see that's not really an objective, because when I say better understand, what does that mean? How do I measure it? How do I achieve that in the time frame, et cetera? So what I'd like us to do in this exercise is take a goal that you might already have or that you might have in your mind, and see if you can pull from that goal some very specific objectives. And here, my question is, how can I take this phrase, better understand the practice of tattooing in ancient Egypt? How can I pull from that specific objectives that add merit, which is something that Lisa brought up before, so that are measurable, so they specify how many, or in this case, which individuals to tattoo or study, that they're end-oriented, so I can identify specific publications or outcomes, that they're realistic, so I'm not overstating. I'm not going to say every single person I meet in Egypt from my ancient dead people are tattooed, right? I'm being honest about what I think I can find. I identify the need, so I can relate what I'm doing to that problem statement we brought up earlier, and it's timed. I can explain how I can accomplish my objective within the grant timeframe. So I took that goal, and in a workshop, I started to think, okay, let me break it out. And I broke it out into 3 specific objectives. So what you'll often find is that for any one goal, you'll probably actually have multiple objectives that all contribute to how you meet that goal. I'm not going to go into each of these, but what I want you to focus on is my starting words, the verbs that I'm using. So whereas my goal is something kind of abstract, understand, right? It's really what does understand mean? My objectives are using very specific verbs like to determine or to test and improve methods. So I'm using words that I can actually measure and achieve in a very short window of time. And in a full grant, what I would do is then take that 1-sentence summary of an objective and build merit into that. So this is not showing the full description of my objective. This is very similar to Lisa's example before. You can see I've outlined my objective in 1 sentence, and then I have a paragraph below that's showing the merit of that objective. So I have sentences identifying need. I demonstrate how my objective is measurable. I show that it's end-oriented. And then if I continue, you'll see some of the other, that it's realistic, for example, and it meets our intended need. That's fine. Kate, you can go to the next one. Yeah. So what I want us to do is to take the last 20 minutes of our workshop to have you guys take a chance to start working on your goals versus objectives. So I'd like everybody to take a few minutes to draft an objective that you want to share in a small group. We're going to do breakout rooms of around 3 people. And this is like a no judgment space. So regardless of where you are in the grant writing process, even if you don't have a grant, what I recommend is if you were to write a grant tomorrow, what would be a goal that you want to achieve? And then taking from that, what's one objective you could use? For that, try to find definitive verbs like identify, characterize, quantify, increase, and avoid these more abstract verbs like understand, examine, attempt, or explore. And just give yourself the time to really fine tune 1-sentence objective, that kind of highlight objective that you would like to then build out. So we're going to do breakout rooms now. Lisa and I are going to jump around and jump into breakout rooms, and then we'll bring us all back in the last couple minutes of our meeting today to just share and reflect.